Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, United States Marine Corps, retired, had run out of road. His wife, Sarah, was gone, lost to a fight that no amount of training could win. His savings were a memory, erased by that same fight. His last few $100s had bought him a forgotten cabin on a ridge in the Ozarks, a place he hadn't seen in 30 years, a place he'd fled as a boy to find a war. Now he was back, not for a reunion, but for an ending. He was there to disappear. But his retired war dog, a scarred Belgian Malinois named Ghost, froze on the second day. The dog stood rigid, fixating on the massive stone hearth, and behind it waited a secret sealed for decades, a secret that would drag Elias back into a war he never chose and give him a reason to live again. The drive back to Harmony Creek was a slow surrender. His old Ford F-150 rattled with every frost heave in the asphalt, the engine ticking like a failing heart. Everything he owned was in the truck bed, covered by a frayed tarp, a footlocker of uniforms he couldn't bring himself to discard, a box of Sarah's books, and the tools he'd used to try and hold their world together. The town, when he finally rolled into it, was smaller and more worn than he remembered. The paint on the storefronts was peeling, and the faces he saw on the single main street were strangers, etched with the same quiet hardship he saw in his own rearview mirror. He joined the Corps to escape this place, to escape the certainty of a life spent in the local quarry or lumber mill. For 30 years, the military had been his home, his purpose. Fallujah, Kandahar, places that had tried to kill him, had felt more real than this town ever had. He carried those places in the shrapnel that still announced itself in his left leg when the weather turned cold, and in the high-frequency ringing in his ears that never truly went away. He carried it in the memory of the IED, the concussive blast that had turned a Humvee into a metal coffin. That was where he'd met Ghost, a military working dog who had latched onto his collar and dragged him, unconscious and bleeding, from the wreckage just before it was consumed by fire. The dog had saved his life then, and he had been saving it every day since, grounding him with a heavy paw on his chest when the nightmares came, his warm presence a bulwark against the hollowing grief of Sarah's passing. Her illness had been a different kind of war, a slow, grueling siege that had taken everything, her light, their money, his hope. Now he was back where he started, a failure by every measure he'd ever set for himself. The cabin wasn't a choice. It was the last square on the map. He'd found it listed as a tax-delinquent property, a place no one else wanted. That suited him. He and Ghost didn't want company. They just wanted quiet. A place to let the ghosts settle for good. The property wasn't for sale in any conventional sense. It had been on the county's books for over a decade, a forgotten line item in a dusty ledger. Elias walked into the Harmony Creek courthouse, a building that smelled of old paper and floor wax, and found his way to the clerk's office. The man behind the counter, Silas Croft, looked as if he'd been carved from the same oak as his desk, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He peered at Elias over a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. "Can I help you?" Elias stated his purpose, asking about the delinquent parcel on Ridgeback Mountain. Silas's eyes narrowed slightly. "Thorne," he said, the name a statement, not a question. "Your father was Jacob Thorne, good man, hard worker at the quarry." He looked Elias up and down, taking in the ramrod posture, the haircut that was still just shy of military regulation. "You were in the service." Another statement. Elias just nodded. The price for the cabin and its 40 acres was the sum of the back taxes and fees, $472.16. It was almost all the money Elias had left in the world. As he filled out the paperwork, Silas leaned forward, his voice dropping. "That place has been empty a long time, son. The fella before you, he was a veteran too. Quiet type. Name of Thomas Miller. Kept to himself. One day he just wasn't there anymore. That was 20, maybe 25 years back." Silas paused, polishing his glasses with a handkerchief. "Some folks said he just packed up and moved on. Others figured he found something in these hills he shouldn't have. For a while after he vanished, men came looking. Not locals. Drove dark sedans with government plates, or so people said. Asked questions. Never found him." Silas pushed the deed across the counter for a final signature. "Just be careful up there. Some secrets in this country are best left buried deep." The warning was delivered with the casual gravity of a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything. Elias signed the paper, the transaction complete. A few hours later, he was bumping up the overgrown track that led to his new home. The cabin was worse than the pictures suggested. The porch steps sagged, and the windows were clouded with grime. But the foundation stones were massive, settled deep into the earth, and the tin roof, while rusted, looked mostly sound. Beneath the decay, the bones were good. It was salvageable. It was his. He and Ghost would make it work. It was a place to hold the line. One last time. The first 2 days were a blur of hard, cleansing labor. Elias swept out the nests of mice and the shrouds of cobwebs, his movements deliberate and efficient. He patched the worst of the leaks in the roof with tar and scrap metal, his hands remembering the familiar work of repair. He cleared the brush from around the cabin, creating a defensible perimeter out of instinct more than necessity. Ghost was his constant shadow, a silent, watchful presence whose occasional nudge of a wet nose was a comfort. The quiet of the woods began to seep into Elias, calming the restless energy that had plagued him for months. The only sounds were the wind whispering through the tall pines and the rhythmic chop of his axe as he split firewood from a fallen oak. The air was clean and cold, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't grief or exhaustion. On the third evening, a cold front swept down from the north, bringing with it a biting wind that rattled the window panes. Elias decided it was time to test the hearth. He stacked the dry oak inside the massive stone fireplace, its opening big enough to stand in. The stones were black with the soot of 1,000 old fires. As the kindling caught and flames began to lick at the larger logs, Ghost, who had been dozing on his blanket, rose to his feet. He walked slowly, deliberately, to the hearth. He didn't look at the fire. His attention was fixed on the stone base to the right of the firebox. He lowered his head, sniffing intently at the mortar between 2 large flagstones. Then he froze. A low, guttural growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound Elias hadn't heard since their last tour in Afghanistan. The dog's hackles were raised, his ears pinned back, his entire body rigid with focused intent. "Ghost, come on, boy, leave it," Elias said, his voice calm. The dog didn't move. He lifted a paw and scratched at one specific stone, a whine of frustration escaping his throat. Elias sighed. It was probably a squirrel's nest, or the den of some other woodland creature tucked into the foundation. But Ghost's intensity was unsettling. This wasn't his casual prey drive alert. This was the same unnerving stillness he adopted just before he signaled the presence of a hidden explosive. The training never left the dog. Elias walked over and tried to gently pull him away by the collar. Ghost resisted, digging his claws into the rough-hewn floorboards, his gaze unwavering. Elias knelt, running his hand over the stone. It looked like all the others, set flush and sealed with old mortar. But when he pressed down hard, he felt a fractional give and heard a faint, hollow echo that shouldn't have been there. He rapped his knuckles on the stone. Thump. He knocked on the one next to it. Thud. The difference was undeniable. Ghost whined again, a sharp, insistent sound, as if to say, "See? I told you." A cold knot tightened in Elias's stomach. The old man's warning about secrets best left buried echoed in his mind. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind outside, that he couldn't ignore what his dog had found. The next morning, with the gray dawn light filtering through the dirty windows, Elias retrieved his tools from the truck. A heavy-duty crowbar, a 3-pound sledgehammer, and a cold chisel. The work was slow and methodical. The old mortar was as hard as iron, and he had to chip it away carefully, bit by bit, trying not to crack the heavy flagstone. Ghost lay a few feet away, his head on his paws, watching every strike of the hammer with an unwavering gaze. He was a silent, anxious supervisor, his presence a constant reminder that this was not a whim. After nearly 2 hours of grueling work, a fine layer of stone dust covering his clothes and arms, Elias had cleared the seam. He wedged the tip of the crowbar into the opening and put his weight into it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan of protesting stone and the screech of metal on rock, the flagstone shifted. He worked the crowbar deeper, levering the massive stone out of its resting place. It tilted up, and he dragged it clear. Beneath it was not the packed earth of a foundation, but a dark, square cavity lined with poured concrete. A small, welded steel hatch was set flush into the concrete floor, its surface pitted with rust. It had a recessed, turning handle, the kind he'd seen on naval vessels and in military bunkers. It was built to last and to keep people out. A draft of cold, stale air, smelling of damp earth and oxidized metal, rose from the opening. He went to his footlocker and pulled out his heavy maglite and the 9mm pistol he always kept, cleaned and ready. He clipped the flashlight to his belt, chambered around, and clicked off the safety. "Stay," he commanded Ghost, his voice low. The dog whined but obeyed, remaining at the edge of the hole as Elias gripped the iron rungs of a steep ladder welded to the side of the shaft and descended into the darkness. The space below was small, a concrete-lined vault no bigger than a deep closet. It was cold and utterly silent. On a simple wooden shelf against the far wall sat 2 olive-drab ammunition cans and a thick, leather-bound journal. He carried them up into the light. The first ammo can was surprisingly heavy. He pried open the latches. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of gold coins. Krugerrands, American Eagles, Canadian maple leafs. It was a fortune, more money than he had ever seen. The second can contained bundles of cash, old, non-sequential bills from the 1980s and 90s, still crisp. Beneath the cash were documents, property deeds, stock certificates, and a thick manila envelope. Inside the envelope were photographs of tanker trucks dumping barrels into a mine shaft, their logos clearly visible. Ridgeback Development. There were also negatives and a typed report detailing the illegal disposal of chemical waste. Finally, he picked up the journal. The name on the inside cover was written in a neat, disciplined hand. Sergeant Major Thomas Miller, U.S. Army Special Forces, retired. Elias began to read. Miller wrote of his own war, of the jungles of Vietnam, and of coming to this very cabin to find a measure of peace. He described finding the evidence of the dumping, of realizing the town's water supply was being poisoned. He wrote of his attempts to bring it to the local sheriff, a man named Caspian, only to realize the lawman was on the company payroll. The gold and cash were Miller's life savings, hidden away from the men he knew would eventually come for him. The last entry, dated 22 years ago, was chilling. "They know I know. Caspian's deputy was just here. Said he was checking on a noise complaint. No one for miles. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. The proof is in this box. Ridgeback is run by Marcus Thorne. Don't trust anyone with that name. Use this to do what's right. Don't let them bury us all. Marcus Thorne." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. His father's older brother, his uncle, the man who had built a local empire and was treated like royalty in Harmony Creek. The secret in the floor was not just a crime. It was a dark and rotten branch of his own family tree. Elias sat on the dusty floorboards, the journal open in his lap, the cold weight of the gold coins and the dead man's words settling deep in his gut. His uncle, the man who'd sent a condolence card after his father's funeral with a crisp $100 bill inside. The respected town patriarch, the benefactor of the annual Founders' Day picnic, was a poisoner and likely a murderer. The quiet of the surrounding woods suddenly felt different. It was no longer a peaceful sanctuary. It was an exposed position, a place of ambush. The trapdoor Miller had built was not just a hiding place. It was a legacy of righteous anger, and by opening it, Elias had just inherited a war. His training took over, a series of cold, logical steps. He carefully repacked the ammo cans and the journal, lowered them back into the vault, and closed the heavy steel hatch. He wrestled the flagstone back into place, mixing a small amount of cement dust with dirt and water to create a paste to disguise the freshly broken mortar seal. It wouldn't hold up to close inspection, but it might pass a casual glance. That night, sleep was impossible. He sat in the dark, his rifle across his lap, the 9mm on the table beside him. Ghost was a dark shape by the cabin door, preternaturally still, his ears twitching at every sigh of the wind. The dog knew. He always knew first. Around 2 a.m, Ghost let out a low, almost inaudible growl. Elias didn't move. He scanned the dark tree line through the window, his eyes adjusted to the gloom. He saw nothing, but he trusted the dog. Then, a brief flicker of movement, a faint glint of moonlight off glass. Binoculars. Someone was out there in the cold, watching the cabin. They stayed for the better part of an hour, a patient, unseen presence. Elias remained motionless, a shadow within the shadows, his breathing slow and even. The watcher eventually retreated, but the message was sent. The next day, Elias drove into town for supplies, needing to see his uncle's face with his own eyes. He found Marcus Thorne at the counter of the town diner, holding court with the mayor and the sheriff. He was older now, his hair silver, but he had the same confident, predatory stillness Elias remembered from childhood. Their eyes met for a brief second across the crowded room. Marcus gave a polite, dismissive nod, the kind a man gives to a stranger. But Elias saw the flicker of cold assessment in that gaze, the quick cataloging of a potential problem. On the drive back to the cabin, Elias found it. A fresh cut, clean and bright, on the heavy chain that blocked his access road. Someone had been up to the cabin while he was gone. They hadn't forced entry, but they had been there. They were scouting. He had barely gotten inside and started a fire when he heard the sound of an approaching engine. A pristine black pickup truck, the kind that costs more than a small house, rolled to a stop. A man in an expensive suit and polished boots got out. He had a salesman's smile that didn't touch his cold, calculating eyes. Mr. Thorne, he said, extending a hand Elias didn't take. My name is Peterson. I'm with Ridgeback Development. I understand you recently acquired this old parcel. My employer, your Uncle Marcus, has a certain sentimental attachment to this area. He'd like to make you a generous offer to buy it back from you. Say $10,000. A quick and easy profit for a piece of land that's more trouble than it's worth. The offer was too smooth, the timing too perfect. Ghost moved to stand between Elias and the man, his lips curling back from his teeth in a silent, menacing snarl. Elias looked Peterson dead in the eye. It's not for sale. Peterson's smile tightened. A pity, he said, his voice losing its friendly veneer. Mr. Thorne can be a very persuasive man. He has a strong sense of what belongs to him. The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the crisp mountain air. They knew someone was in Miller's cabin, and now they were testing him, seeing if he could be bought off or scared away. Elias knew he couldn't afford to be passive. He was isolated, a single man against a powerful local figure who had controlled this valley for decades. He needed information, and he needed an ally. His mind went back to the county clerk, Silas Croft. The old man had issued a warning, a subtle signal that he was not part of the town's silent conspiracy. He drove back to the courthouse the next afternoon, timing his arrival for the end of the day. He found Silas locking the heavy oak doors to the archives. Elias didn't reveal what he'd found. He didn't need to. He simply asked about Thomas Miller, the veteran who had disappeared. Silas's weary eyes met his, and a silent understanding passed between them. Knew something wasn't right with that, Silas muttered, unlocking the door he'd just secured. Come on in. He led Elias into the dusty, cavernous archive room, the air thick with the scent of decaying paper. Miller was a good man, Silas said, pulling a heavy, string-bound file from a high shelf. Started asking questions about the old silver mines up on the ridge, about the water quality in the creeks. He came in here a few times, pulling old deeds, looking at geological surveys. He was smart, methodical. Silas opened the file. Inside was a missing person report, barely a page long. Then one day, he was just gone. Sheriff Caspian, the man who was sheriff back then, he filed this report, closed it a month later, said Miller moved on without a word. Case closed. Silas tapped a yellowed newspaper clipping attached to the file. It was a short article about Sheriff Caspian's retirement, noting his move to a waterfront property in Florida. Retired rich for a small-town sheriff, Silas said dryly. The man who took over for him, our current Sheriff Brody, was Caspian's hand-picked deputy for 10 years. The same deputy Miller had mentioned in his final journal entry. The pieces were clicking into place with sickening clarity. Miller had uncovered the dumping operation. He'd tried to go through official channels and had run into a wall of corruption, fronted by the sheriff's department and owned by Marcus Thorne. When he couldn't be bought or scared off, he was eliminated. And now, Elias's unexpected arrival had disturbed his 20-year-old grave. The threats began to escalate from veiled to overt. He returned to the cabin to find the door jamb splintered, the door pushed open. They hadn't been subtle. They had gone through his meager possessions, not taking anything, but making it clear they could enter at will. It was a violation, a message that his sanctuary was not safe. That night, Ghost's frantic barking woke him from a light, troubled sleep. Elias grabbed his rifle and moved to the door. The dog was outside, circling his F-150. In the pale moonlight, Elias could see the problem. All 4 tires were flat, slashed open at the sidewalls. He was stranded. The message was now brutally simple. You are trapped. You are not leaving this mountain. He went back inside and took out Miller's journal again, his hands shaking slightly with cold fury. He read the last entry over and over, searching for anything he might have missed. Don't let them bury us all. And then he saw it. In the bottom margin of the last page, scrawled so faintly it was almost invisible, were a series of numbers and a name. 4/17/89. Sarah Jenkins. He didn't know the date's significance, but he knew the name. Sarah Jenkins had been the town librarian when he was a boy. She'd been kind to him, always setting aside books on history and exploration. She was retired now, but she still lived in town. Miller must have trusted her. She was his only lead. His truck disabled, the net was tightening. Elias was cut off, but not out of options. He had a small ham radio in his footlocker, a relic of his time in Force Recon. He powered it up and, using a coded frequency, reached a fellow Marine veteran who ran a garage 2 towns over. He explained the situation in clipped, concise terms. Help was coming, but it would be discreet and it would take time. He couldn't wait. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, he began the 10-mile walk into Harmony Creek. He moved through the woods, paralleling the road, his senses on high alert. Every snapped twig, every hoot of an owl was a potential threat. He found Sarah Jenkins's small house on a quiet side street. Lights were on inside. She answered the door. A small, frail woman now, but her eyes were still as sharp and intelligent as he remembered. He saw the flicker of fear in them when he introduced himself, a thorn standing on her doorstep after dark. He didn't waste time. "I'm living in the Miller cabin," he said softly. "I need to talk to you about him." The fear in her eyes was replaced by a deep, ancient sadness. She ushered him inside. She confirmed everything. She and Thomas Miller had been friends, 2 lonely souls in a town full of secrets. He had told her what he'd found, what he feared Marcus Thorne would do. Before he disappeared, he had given her a key to a safety deposit box in a bank 1 county over. He said if he ever vanished, she whispered, her hands trembling as she retrieved a small, tarnished brass key from a jewelry box. I was to wait. Wait for someone I could trust. Someone with the courage to see it through. She handed him the key. "The date you mentioned, April 17th, 1989. That was the day my brother died. He was a geologist. The county coroner called it a hiking accident, but he had been taking water samples for Tom near the old mines." As Elias pocketed the key and turned to leave, headlights flooded the front window. A dark sedan screeched to a halt at the curb. 2 large men, thick-necked and clad in heavy jackets, got out. They were not from Ridgeback's corporate office. These were hired muscle. "Mr. Thorne wants his property back," one of them grunted, blocking the path. Elias didn't hesitate. He vaulted over Sarah's back fence, hitting the ground in a roll. He used the maze of darkened backyards and narrow alleyways he remembered from his youth, moving with a fluid silence that the heavy-footed thugs couldn't match. He evaded them, melting into the shadows, but the message was clear. The time for negotiation was over. He made it back to the ridge just before dawn, his lungs burning from the forced march. He smelled it before he saw it, the acrid stench of wood smoke and gasoline. As he crested the final rise, he saw his cabin engulfed in flames, a roaring pyre against the dark sky. And at the end of his access road, parked with its lights off, was Sheriff Brody's cruiser. They weren't just trying to scare him. They were trying to erase him, the cabin, and the stone hearth with its hidden vault. A wave of fury, cold and pure, washed over him. Then he heard it, a desperate, frantic barking from inside the burning structure. Ghost. He was trapped. Without a second thought, Elias sprinted toward the inferno. He smashed a window with a rock and yelled the dog's name. A moment later, Ghost scrambled through the opening, his fur singed. Just as he cleared the window, a heavy, burning roof beam collapsed, pinning the dog's hind leg. Ghost yelped in agony. Elias lunged forward, dragging the injured animal away from the collapsing cabin. Seeing Ghost, his loyal companion hurt because of him, broke something that had been frozen inside Elias for years. The hollow resignation shattered, replaced by a diamond-hard resolve. This ended now. He saw the two thugs moving toward the fire, carrying gas cans to finish the job. Sheriff Brody was getting out of his car, a smug, satisfied look on his face. Elias came out of the darkness like a ghost. He didn't start the violence, but he ended it with the brutal efficiency of a man who had survived a dozen firefights. He neutralized the two thugs before they even knew he was there, using their own momentum to leave them groaning on the ground. He confronted Brody by his cruiser. The sheriff, startled, fumbled for his weapon, but Elias was already on him, his movements a blur of combat-honed reflexes. He disarmed Brody, slamming him against the side of the car, the sheriff's own pistol pressed under his chin. "It's over," Elias said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He reached into the cruiser, grabbed the radio handset, and keyed the mic. He requested immediate state police backup, reporting an active arson, assault on an officer, and naming Sheriff Brody as the perpetrator. He gave his name, rank, and location. He had made it official. The conspiracy, so long protected by silence and fear, had just been cracked wide open. The arrival of the state police cruisers, their blue and red lights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, was the beginning of the end for Marcus Thorne's empire. Sheriff Brody, caught with gasoline on his hands and Elias's boot on his neck, folded completely. In a desperate attempt to save himself, he confessed everything, laying out 2 decades of corruption, intimidation, and murder, all orchestrated by Marcus Thorne. He detailed how he and the former sheriff, Caspian, had helped make Thomas Miller disappear, staging it to look like he'd simply left town. The key Sarah Jenkins had given Elias was the final nail in the coffin. It opened a safety deposit box that contained Miller's meticulously organized evidence, the original notarized copies of incriminating company memos, the lab results from the contaminated water samples, and a detailed ledger of payoffs to local officials, all in Thorne's own handwriting. It was an unimpeachable record of his crimes. Federal agents and EPA investigators descended on Harmony Creek. Marcus Thorne was arrested at his sprawling mansion, led away in handcuffs while his curated image as the town's benevolent patriarch shattered like glass. The story became a national sensation. The broken veteran returned home to die, who had single-handedly unearthed a conspiracy of poison and murder. The forgotten victims, Sergeant Major Thomas Miller, Sarah Jenkins's geologist brother, and a half-dozen others who had asked the wrong questions or refused to sell their land, were finally given a name and a voice. Their disappearances were no longer local rumors. They were federal murder investigations. Elias stood amid the smoking, charred ruins of his cabin. The massive stone hearth was all that remained, blackened by the flames but still standing, a stubborn monument to the truth it had guarded. Ghost was at his side, his injured leg professionally bandaged by a state police medic, his body pressed firmly against Elias's good leg. Later that day, the Marine vet he'd radioed for tires showed up, He wasn't alone. He'd brought a convoy of pickup trucks and a crew of a dozen other veterans from across the state who had seen the news. They brought lumber, roofing tin, tools, and coolers full of food and beer. "Heard a brother was in a firefight," one of them, a grizzled Army Ranger, said with a grim smile. "Figured you could use some reinforcements." They started rebuilding the cabin, not as it was, but better, stronger. Their easy camaraderie a balm on Elias's soul. He used a portion of the gold from Miller's vault to establish the Thomas Miller Environmental Trust, a legal fund dedicated to helping other rural communities fight corporate polluters. He ensured Miller's name would be remembered not as a victim, but as a hero who had made a final, defiant stand. Miller's unfinished war was now his own. The news story reached his estranged daughter, Maya, in California. He hadn't spoken to her in 2 years, the chasm between them carved by Sarah's death and his own subsequent retreat from the world. One evening, his satellite phone rang. It was her. The conversation was hesitant at first, filled with the ghosts of things left unsaid. Then her voice broke. "I saw the news, Dad," she said, emotion thickening her words. "I'm so proud of you." There was a long pause. I'd like to come see you. I want to meet Ghost." A connection he had mourned as another casualty of his life was not severed after all. It had only been waiting for him to come home. 6 months later, a new cabin stood on the ridge, built of solid oak and smelling of fresh-cut pine. It was more than a shelter. It was a home, built by the hands of brothers in arms. Maya was there, spending the autumn with him before starting a new job nearby. She was stacking firewood on the porch, her laughter carrying on the crisp air. Ghost, now with a permanent but dignified limp, was dozing contentedly by the new hearth, which Elias had insisted they build using the original fire-blackened stones. He stood on the porch, looking out over the same valley he had returned to in utter defeat. The town of Harmony Creek was changing. The Ridgeback Development Corporation was dismantled, its assets seized. The cleanup of the old mines had begun, a slow and arduous process of healing the land. The place he had chosen to disappear, to let his story end, had instead become the one place on earth he was meant to be. It hadn't been an end at all, but a beginning. The $472 he'd spent on a derelict property hadn't bought him a grave. It had bought him back his life. He thought of Sergeant Major Miller, a fellow soldier who had refused to surrender his post, even in death. Miller had left a map and a mission, a torch passed through time, and Elias had been there to catch it. The quiet certainty of a loyal dog, the discovery of a dead man's words, and the stubborn refusal of a man everyone had written off to simply fade away. They had all converged on this small patch of land and changed everything. He was no longer Master Sergeant Thorne, the broken veteran haunted by his ghosts. He was Elias Thorne, a man who had found his purpose, not in a distant foreign war, but right here in the forgotten hills of home, protecting the land and the people that held his roots. The unwavering loyalty of one good dog had saved him from more than just a burning Humvee in the desert all those years ago. It had saved him from himself and led him all the way home.